Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers. In the holiday spirit, and I mean the best holiday, Thanksgiving, what's new and exciting in your world?
This episode will come out the day before Thanksgiving, and we should start by giving thanks to all of the people who support us, starting with Andrew Mount, who does a tremendous amount of work helping us to edit our podcasts and manage our memes, to the good people on the Words and Numbers Backstage group and Facebook, to our Patreon sponsors and the many people who from time to time write us checks to help keep Words and Numbers running.
And to everybody who listens, which, makes the whole thing possible in the first place.
Yes, and the many listeners out there, we thank all of you.
Yeah, there's a ton of people listening out there, and I'd like to meet every last one of you, but of course, I don't really mean that.
James doesn't want to meet anybody. He doesn't even want to meet me.
Oh, I would prefer not to meet you for a very long time.
I ran across a group, Inoculation Science. There's a group of academics who put together a set of videos named Truth Labs. The intent here is, in their words, to inoculate people against misinformation. These videos show up in the ad space in YouTube. So when you start a YouTube video and it has an ad, one of these things might run. And it runs for maybe a minute. Each one of them is an animated video not directed at specific information. So this is a nonpartisan, it's more than nonpartisan. They aren't even talking about specific facts. Rather, it ends up being a kind of schoolhouse rock version of logical fallacies. I've seen a couple of them, one on scapegoating and another on emotional language, that describes to people what these things are, gives you examples of how they can be used to manipulate the viewer. The researchers here have done more than just put together the videos, which I think are pretty good, but they've actually done research into the effect of these things and found that one of these things I call the microdose. A microdose of this, you watch the video for whatever it is, 60 seconds or so, and it makes the viewers much less susceptible to these logical fallacies when they encounter them. I found this interesting. It's something that people who run in our circles have been harping about for at least a decade or two, that people don't take logical fallacies seriously. And I suppose once upon a time, that was a cornerstone of what one might call a liberal arts education, though not so much anymore.
Things have gotten so bad that I don't even believe anything you just said. I mean, we're going to have to wait and see. I really don't. When a bunch of academics say we're going to do this nonpartisan thing, what they almost always mean is we're going to do this crackpot thing.
I have to tell you, I've watched a couple of their videos, and they're very non-contextual in that sense. They talk about what I would term logical fallacies, and they do not reference any of the sorts of things that you would encounter in discussions of politics or economics or any of that. I think they capture the ideas of these fallacies quite well.
On my side of things, and I know that this will confuse you because it includes the word football, but a football game last week, Sunday last, had to be moved from Buffalo to Detroit because there was too much snow in Buffalo.
Believe it or not, James, I actually saw some of that game.
Isn't that amazing?
I was out somewhere with my wife, and they had on the TV screen in the back of the bar or whatever it was, and I'm looking because from a distance, it looked like they were playing on sand. And I'm trying to think to myself, who holds a football game on sand?
That game had to be moved from Buffalo to Detroit. They did not play that game in the snow because there was simply too much of it. About 6 feet fell one day last week. Think about how bad it would have to be for people in Buffalo who deal with this all the time to say, this one is special. Let's shut everything down. It kind of brought home this other thing that I've been paying attention to from the East Coast, and that's home heating prices. The headline's, of course, usually a little worse than it is. It's like living in an igloo. People are turning off their heat as prices surge. Is it that bad? I doubt it. Are people turning down their settings? I bet they are.
Sure.
Because prices are up 18% nationwide against last year's 17% increase.
This is no different than when I was a teenager. My father would insist on the heat not being set above 65 degrees, and if you're cold, you put a sweater on. That was during the oil crisis of the late 70s.
I remember that, and we, too, turned our thermostat down a bit. I don't know how many people are turning it all the way off. I suspect that there are some. And that's going to cause all kinds of problems. But the broader point here is that this is expensive and becoming more so.
Yep.
And people are going to have to account for this in their budgeting, which necessarily means they won't have money to spend on other things. That night out for a dinner or, even a fast food trip, pizza, what have you, might not happen now. And all the businesses out there are also going to have to account for the rise in prices of heating. And before you know it, during what is already a pretty difficult time economically, things are about to get a bit worse.
This is something interesting we talk about in economics. The technical term is elasticity. When the price of something like heating oil or electricity or what have you goes up, do you cut back more on that thing, or do you cut back more on other things so that you can afford to maintain almost as much of that thing as you did before? And when it comes to something like heating your house, we would say that's highly inelastic. The price goes up and you're going to cut back on other things so that you can afford to maintain this thing.
For me, this is a meaningless conversation living in the desert. It only gets reasonable here in the wintertime.
Well, let's wait till this summer when you got to pay for air conditioning.
That's exactly right. Come April and May, and it's 115 degrees outside, I'm going to sing a different song. We all face these problems when we face them, and this winter is not going to be a great one if you're living in the Northeast or the Midwest. For the foolishness of the weekend, as is often the case, it was kind of hard to figure out what we were doing. The headline here, Lyft drivers spread the gospel with ride-hailing ministries.
Oh, how interesting.
I don't want to hear it. Nobody wants to hear it.
Well, somebody wants to hear it.
When I hire an Uber or a Lyft, what I really want to hear about is how they're going to get there on time and transport me safely.
Do you remember the woman who picked us up in an Uber? Good Lord, must have been like 3 years ago. And she had a side business making iced tea mix or something. Yeah.
Iced tea.
Yeah. And so she was using this opportunity in the car to peddle her product.
And that was good for me because all she did was hand us a business card. She didn't get into it until we asked her about it.
Right.
Which for me was fine. I enjoyed that Uber ride tremendously. Not as much as that guy from South America who was driving Uber so he could regain his status as a doctor in the United States. You might remember him.
Sure.
And that was the most life-affirming thing that happened to me in a 5-year stretch. That brings me to another religious issue. The Qataris, you might be aware, and this is going to be the only time I ever use the word soccer on a podcast, but they went ahead and got the World Cup, and they had to build a big giant stadium because they didn't have any. So they did this, and a bunch of migrant workers died, right? This is just a disaster from cover to cover. People don't realize this. Qatar has about 3 million people. That's how many people live in the country of Qatar. So it's a tiny place, and the World Cup is always a big place kind of thing. Think Mexico City, places like that. So they bid on it. They built a big giant stadium. They did everything they were supposed to do. And then just a couple of days before the event started, they declared that they had changed their minds and would now not allow alcohol in at all.
Oh.
Because one of the things they had to do was set it up so everybody could get a beer. And they agreed to do that. And then they said when nobody could turn around and say, well, now you don't get the World Cup at all. They just turned around and said, well, up yours, we're doing what we want now because of ... religion or something. And then it gets better and worse at the same time. The good people over at Budweiser brought all the beer over to Qatar and then we're stuck with it.
Right. Yeah. What do you do with it now?
They had this brilliant PR idea. I want to find who came up with this idea and interview him at great length on this podcast. They decided what they were going to do is donate it to the winning country. So whoever wins the World Cup, they're going to put all this Budweiser on a plane and fly it on over and give it away. That's an inspired thing to do.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say they handed out for free there. Of course, I guess that would get them into all sorts of trouble.
Yeah, they'd all have to go to jail for that, given, the illiberal nature of Qatar. And look, I think this should serve as a warning. When major sporting events are being negotiated, sometimes you should say no thank you when a country says we want to host you. And I'm thinking those awful Russian Olympics where there were toilets built into literally the center of bedrooms and these sorts of things. Well, you could have said no to Russia. There were countries very well equipped to handle this. They were not. So too, Qatar, you know there's going to be all kinds of friction with all kinds of issues about liberalism, from gay rights on the one hand, and people had to take armbands off that showed support for the gay community because they were going to be penalized literally on the field in the middle of a soccer game if the referees saw them. Mm-hmm. When these sorts of things happen, you have only yourself to blame because you should have known. There's no surprises here. And they lied. Also, not a surprise. And you should think about having anything hosted by an illiberal country. In one form or another, this is what you get.
To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible. If you'd like to support Words and Numbers, make your way over to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers, where you can contribute to our podcast-making habits. If you'd like to schedule us to come speak at your event, be it corporate or educational, or have James officiate at your wedding, send us an email at wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
We spent a fair amount of time a couple of weeks ago talking about the world population as it passes through that 8 billion people mark.
Right. This was 1 week ago as this episode comes out. 8 billion people.
That's a lot of people. And look, life is better. There's no problem with a growing population. And we all seem to do better off as the world becomes more crowded. And then here's where it gets to the unfortunate part, because there are further developments. It seems to be the case. Oh, God, I don't even want to say these words. Sperm count is dwindling.
Dwindling is an understatement. It's down in the U.S. 50% over just the past few years.
So here's the deal. The global population is, in fact, growing and shows absolutely no sign of abating. But that's not true in each country. We're left with a very strange set of circumstances.
It's very odd, particularly coming off of last week's episode, talking about the 8 billion world population, how this is perfectly fine, and actually we live better lives than we did when the world population was far less than it is now. And you started me down this path of the low sperm count, which led me to look at population growth rates. And all of a sudden, an interesting story emerges.
A fascinating thing leaps right off the page.
There's a marked difference in the population growth rate amongst developed versus developing countries. And you can see it almost in lockstep. The more developed the developing country is, the lower the population growth rate is. And if you recall, last week when we were talking about all the wonderful things that are going on in the world, even in light of, or because of, depending how you think of it, the world population, one of the things I pointed to was the environment. And I said that it seems that we have two different worlds here, the developed world and the developing world, where the developed world environmentally is looking better and better each year. The developing world is not looking nearly as good, but is progressing. And I said last week, it looks like the developing world, depending on what measures you're looking at, is about 40 years behind the developed world. That is, when our pollution peaked and then started to come down, that seemed to be about 40 years prior to when it happened in the developing world. And would you believe I'm seeing the same phenomenon with population growth rate? It's astounding. Let me throw out some of this. And some of it is actually a little bit disturbing. Well, I say it's disturbing because I had no idea until I started digging into this. United States. Our population growth rate averaged about 1% per year. This is from like the 1950s up until 2019, so just a couple of years ago. Then it dropped from 1% to 1/3%. And then it dropped in the most recent data from the 1/3% to 1/10%.
0.1%. Unpack that for me. Tell me everything that means.
This would have been from 2020 to 2021. The U.S. population grew by 0.1%.
And isn't this interesting yet? Because here is yet another thing about which I was very wrong. I expected birth rates to go up significantly because everybody was on house arrest.
That's
for
right.
COVID. And when you've watched the last Netflix thing that you can watch, well, You're going to have to find some other way to take up your time.
Right. It seems to be the case that we're just now, as I'm looking at the data, I'm catching it just as it's going to cross the 0 mark. So it could well be the case, given what I'm looking at, that the U.S. population right now is maxed out at 330 million.
And isn't that weird, right? I would have never used that phrase.
Now, that's assuming it's maxed out. It could be the case that we follow Japan and go into negative growth. Japan's population peaked in 2009.
Get out of here.
Yeah, at 128 million, and it has been declining ever since then. They're down to 126 million now.
So they've lost 2 million people.
They've lost 2 million people, and all the indications are that the decline in the population is accelerating.
Right. So at 2 million over how many years? What was that?
2009 to 2020, so roughly a decade.
So it takes them a decade to lose 2 million people. Even if that trend accelerates, that's probably not going to move the needle of the quality of life in Japan all that much. But what about the trend? Understanding that 2 million people are gone, that also means that an entire generation is aging out, and this may accelerate quite quickly. What does that mean when you start thinking about things like a social safety net, which all of the developed world has? Whether you agree with it or disagree with it, want it or don't want it, it exists. Is it going to continue to exist if we get a significant downturn in population?
There's all kinds of interesting things that happen here. Let me warn everybody against going off the deep end and saying, well, declining population, this is the end of the world, it's doomsday and all of that. It's not. I think there's going to be changes.
In fairness, this is the stuff of science fiction.
It is, but I think what you get here are, you'll get a whole bunch of things. One that you've identified is the social safety nets. These are going to be very hard pressed because they were designed as Ponzi schemes. You've got more people feeding into the pot than there's taking out of the pot. And now if you've got declining population, you could end up in an upside down situation, as we've been headed to in the United States with Social Security for a long time, that all of a sudden more people are drawing out than are paying in.
They really don't work that well in the first place.
I don't want to say they're designed to fail, but if I were to design a system that would ultimately fail, it would look a lot like what our current social welfare system looks like.
Of course it would. It absolutely is a Ponzi scheme, which means you need more people putting in than you have taking out. If we've got a population that is dwindling, these things are going to fail. It's just a matter of how long it will take.
There are some other things that are going to change, and I don't want to say these are going to be problems, but they're going to be winners and losers here. One of them is the housing market. In the United States, we're used to housing only going up. And people will talk about houses as an investment because it's a safe thing. You put your money in, you could sell it 10 years later and make your money back. And that's been the case in the United States pretty much for the past 4 or 5 generations, maybe even further.
I have an example. My house in Greensburg, Pennsylvania, we lived in the same town.
Right.
I bought a house in Greensburg, Pennsylvania. It was a nice house. It wasn't beautiful. I mean, it was just a utilitarian house. There weren't a lot of houses on the market when I moved in. But then the Rolling Rock factory closed down and the steel mill in town started doing more with fewer people. And before you knew it, there was an outflow of population. We had a negative population growth problem in that town. And then I had to sell the house. Guess what you can't do when there's a negative population
Right.
problem? People were offering me literally half what I was asking because they kind of figured maybe he's not going to go for this crazy deal, but somebody will soon enough.
And so you're going to have this problem. Of course, it's going to vary depending on where you are in the United States. But generally speaking, if you've got a declining population, you're also going to have a declining demand for housing. And you're going to see housing prices going down, not up, over a long term.
And having said that, aren't you going to find that there's less demand for almost everything?
There's going to be less demand for other things as well because you've got a dwindling consumer base. Now, what also happens is the nature of how you produce is going to change. So I don't think that we're going to see a decline in GDP, which you might point to and say, well, you got fewer people, so now there are fewer people buying and selling things and fewer people producing things, and so your economy is going to start to slow down. I don't think that's going to happen. I do think it's going to slow, but I don't think it's going to go negative. I think you're going to see a shift away from the production of goods that require human labor toward the production of goods that require machinery, capital. And in the developing world, where it's the reverse, they will continue to have population growth. I think you'll see a shift in the other direction. The developing world will emphasize goods produced by human labor, which I guess they're already doing because they're behind us technologically. But I think you'll see this shift globally, where the developed world starts, even more so than it is now, focusing on capital goods, and the developing world focusing more on human-produced goods.
It does seem that the trends that are already evident are likely to continue as these population ripples push out. I don't think it's going to be a catastrophe, not by a long shot, but I think it's going to be interesting, and I think some people will have a very hard time because of it.
I think someone who misunderstands what we're saying here will look at this and say, well, I see what's happening. The world's going to divide into two groups, the haves and the have-nots. And that's not what we're saying, because the developing world is going through the same transition that we went through to get to where we are. They're just 40 to 60 years behind us. They too, around 40 to 60 years from now, will be experiencing exactly what we're experiencing.
And whatever ends up being the case here in the U.S., we might just have a flat line where we maintain the same standard of living, but we don't improve upon it.
I'm more optimistic than that. I think we will continue to see improvements in standard of living. What I think we won't see is the exponential improvement that we have experienced over our lifetimes, over the past, 50 to 100 years. We had exponential increase. I don't think we're going to see exponential increase moving forward in the developed world, but I do think we'll see a linear increase.
That's going to be satisfying enough for almost everybody. You hit a certain standard of living and you look around and you say, well, this is great. And if it just stayed like this for the rest of my life, that would be okay. I would prefer that it improve all the way around. If it doesn't, it's very hard to make the case that we live terrible lives. We don't.
So our children and their children will live better lives than we do. But what they won't experience is what you and I experienced. The life we live today, this is not hyperbole, is science fiction compared to the lives that we lived when we were teenagers.
That's right.
My favorite show when I was a teenager was Star Trek. It was into reruns then, but it was relatively new, and this is the original series. Apart from the spaceship and the transporters, everything you see on Star Trek, we have now, and it's better than what we saw on Star Trek.
I don't think we had the diagnostic tools that Bones McCoy had, right? He'd get this little tiny thing and wave it about near a person and say, oh, here's all the problems with this person. Your larger point is so much on the nose. Everything that's in my house right now would have been unbelievable to a person just 60 years before. And not only that, my house is gigantic. You can fit 3 of the house I grew up in inside my house. It's not like people drive by my place and say, look at that mansion over there. I'm in a house that is relatively unremarkable, except when I compare it to how I grew up. And I grew up a working class life. We didn't want for much.
I want to go back to the population numbers for a moment and look at some other geographic areas. Just to recap, U.S. annual population growth averaged 1% up until a couple of years ago. Now it's down to almost 0. So it looks like the United States is now maxed out at 330 million people. Japan has been shrinking since 2009, and their shrinkage seems to be accelerating. They're around 126 million people. The European Union, they also are down to 0.1% increase. So it seems that they maxed out a little bit less than 450 million people. So here we got 3 of the major developed areas. Now let's go to China. 1.4 billion people. Their growth rate has been straight lining down since about the 1960s. They are also at 0.1%, basically 0. India seems to be catching up to China. They're almost at 1.4 billion people. Their growth rate is slowing, but it's still around 1%. What I see happening over the next few years is India's population will start to exceed China's. It's now going to become the big population center in the world, but they're showing declines as well. So India, I don't know what you want to call it, 10 years, 20 years down the road, they're going to top out. I don't know at what. But all of that slowing and topping out of populations stands athwart the projections for world population. The UN projects that the world population is going to continue to grow for the next 60 years, maxing out at 10 billion. That's 2 billion more people than we have. So here's the question. Where are they going to come from? Because I just listed the major population centers, all of which seem to be maxed out right now. That extra 2 billion is largely going to come from Africa, because Africa is about 40 to 60 years behind the developed world in terms of their economies, and so too it seems to be in terms of their populations.
And we're probably going to see something interesting, I would think, in South America. What you need to do is find the poorest countries, and that's where the population's going to come from. Everywhere we look in the developed world, we see dwindling population numbers. We got here from a headline on a news story about global sperm counts. Nature seems to be complicit in this trend. It's in no small part going to be driven by physical realities.
Therein lies an interesting tale. What we're dealing with here, world population, is the same class of animal as the environment, the same class of animal as an economy. That is, it's a complex dynamic system. And complex dynamic systems tend to be self-correcting. The reason I say that is because those that aren't self-correcting will very quickly blow up to either, infinity or zero. But those that persist are self-correcting. And a self-correcting complex system, you want to leave pretty much hands off. Any attempt you make to control it will largely end up just making things worse because you don't understand the complex interactions that are going on, and the thing doesn't need to be controlled anyway. It's self-correcting.
And that's where it gets really interesting, right? Everything that we said last week now has to be read differently, through a different lens at least. I'm happy to admit I don't know where all this is going to lead. A prediction on it would be foolish. At this point, I'm just willing to say, wow, that's some fascinating thing we just stumbled upon here. When I was a boy, my mother once said there was a catastrophe in the offing somewhere. I can't even remember where. She said, well, nature has a way of sorting these things out. And, that's not wrong. It's simplistic. It doesn't get into the marrow of things, but it's certainly not wrong. And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.